Hi, this is Mark. In this video, I'm going to talk about MBTI function analysis. There's a lot of misconceptions regarding MBTI. You got one side, they're mentioning MBTI as pseudoscience, and, there's other side that puts a lot of emphasis onto it, on MBTI. But the thing is with any system, it's not going to be perfect, and there's a lot of course, it's very subjective, and the test is very biased, and a lot of times when you attach to these preconceived notions of what you believe is um, just ideal, and when you mix in all the stereotypes and you funnel it all into the equation, it can kind of lead you to this direction, and it's really like the key is understanding the functions and utilizing it to, as a learning platform. Um, in terms of type, for me, I don't really uh, care about my type, but either way, I just kind of I like understanding how the functions work, and of course, we're not all fit into a box, and everything evolves, and it depends on the position and time and where we are and where we stand. But the key thing to consider is these functions. It all exists. I tend to believe it all. It all exists on the spectrum. Whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, you can create a spectrum. You got one direction, one extreme, you got the other extreme. Whether you're intuitive or whether you're a sensor, you got one extreme, you got another extreme. And you're not always fixated. You're not always positioned at like a absolute point. Everyone within a lifespan exists within a range of experience, range of what would have been, what has transpired. Depending on stress, or one event could change the trajectory. And it ultimately causes these functions to evolve or change. Shift over time. So of course, everything is not, it's not going to be static. It's very transient. And that's one thing to consider. There's, of course, a lot of misconceptions. But I'm going to kind of go through all the functions of what I believe, or what I think, represents. Of course, there's 16 functions. I'm going to start with, um, thinking, and then I'm going to go, start with introvert and extrovert functions, and then go on to um, sensing and intuition, and then I'm going to explain um, the feeling functions, and um, I'm going to leave out like in terms of the judging and the perceiving, but I'm just going to explain these, the modes of processing, or how we can process information differently. So in terms of thinking, there's a pretty clear, or not it's not clear, it's not a full clear picture in terms of, because anything that we learned is not absolute. It's not going to be fully absolute, but there is a definitive distinction between, if you focusing on introverted thinking versus extroverted thinking. Basically, what I think I like to think of as channel, which direction you channel energy. So if you're considering like introverted thinking, they're channeling their energy inward, and essentially trying to make sense, and compiling and organizing the information to make sense logically and coherently. So like with any processing information, introverted functions go inward, they converge. So you can think of, you have bits of information from the external, as external sources, and the introvert functions compile those bits, and it's like a force that is directed inward. So basically, the stronger the introversion, the more the force. Think of like an atom, atomic particle. You have the nucleus, you have the mass, you have the gravitational pull, just like the force that pulls the fields together, organizes it. So same with bits of information in introvert thinking. The stronger the introvert thinking, the more organization, the more coherence, the more density, the more compile this information in a given event frame. You can compile and organize and be able to make sense in the links and the chains, and condense this information into like you could, it's not really density per se, but you could think of I like to think of it as the organization of the amount of information that can be processed and assimilated and compacted within a given frame or time frame. And so I like to think of like an introvert thinker. If it's very strong of a function, it's able to be confident within that realm and be able to organize coherently. Now, of course, the inferior function, if you go the other direction, the inferior function is really kind of like related to confidence, and due to that, a lot of times it shows the insecurity side. So an introvert thinker in the inferior function, to overcompensate with that, they may put a lot of emphasis on using that function to mitigate the insecurity. So of course, it's not so easy, to clearly distinguish, these sides. And of course, because these are preferences, I like to think of, these functions as the ways in which we, how would I put it? I like to think we receive reward, of course, differently. And depending on this domain as a function, we're receiving reward. It's like a force that draws us to prefer or to go in that direction because it feeds us, it gives us reward. So an introvert thinker gets reward by making sense logically, building their own coherent system. So therefore, they're gonna, if you shoot an arrow at a target, it's going to be very precise because that's where that when they're in the zone. So the arrows are going to be in this one domain, and that happens to be introvert thinking. And then you have conversely, you have extrovert thinking. Extrovert thinking it's reliant on external sources. It's more breadth, so it covers more ground. Anyone who wants to get into businesses, who want to lead people, who want to, order, regulate, in a step-by-step process, kind of, lead to get direct to this point, given and give the clear cut facts or information that is precise, is not is efficient, and it basically is relevant. So extrovert thinkers focus more on relevancy of information that they can validate or verify scientifically, or within the realms of science. So they put more emphasis on the scientific method, for instance, and they are you can use this information in so many different ways and manipulate it in so many different ways. So they're kind of like playing with that field, information, and being able to gather so many bits of information from external sources and then compile it and eventually use an introvert function to organize it. So that's why there's pairings in MBTI. So that's the big distinction between extrovert thinking and introvert thinking. It's just a direction that and of course, because it exists on the spectrum, it's not so clear cut, especially when you get towards the central limit. If you're kind of like, I'm sure there's ratios and everyone's kind of in like all over the place. So of course it can be complex when you're kind of you're more centered, and you're not like you're more of an ambivert versus an introvert. Because of course at the extremes it's more higher probability of kind of gauging something, as or even categorizing. But so that's like with those two functions, thinking it's, and then when you get into like intuition, that's kind of where it gets a little bit harder, because intuition is not something that is so, it's not, of course, it's not like sensory information. It's this, that's clear, that's like direct. But intuition, it's more, it's something that is intangible. It doesn't, it's abstract, and it doesn't need sensory. It's like you have an insight or something that you can kind of gauge as true, or like makes sense subjectively, but in actuality, it may, and it's always going to be predicated. Intuition is always going to be predicated on sensory. It has to start with a point, and it doesn't just derive. It derives from the patterns and the interrelations that happen over many of different events. So intuition is more, it's like a direction. But when it comes to introverted intuition, this is intro. You're going inward now. It's going to be more narrowed and convergent. So the big thing about introversion is it's going to be more convergent towards like a point. So a lot of times you'll find introvert intuitives who can be very insightful. They just like have all these whether it's ideas, revelations, or just they kind of know, they have a sense of where things are, the trajectory of time, space, or projection into the future. They have a trajectory of like events, how the events are going to play out, in their framework, and they have a belief. So basically, the confidence, like when you have an interintuitive, for their future, they tend to be confident in terms of where things are heading, because they're in the zone. They like a lot of times finding the interrelations between things, and they're using those interrelations to kind of project their life to where they want to achieve maximal attainment of reward, satisfaction. So they tend to have this drive. They like to, they notice changes. They notice things like are gonna occur as a projection, and maybe depending on the function that they're pairing it with, they're gonna be very, very much driven to try to change, or get to their idealization, bring those ideas to life, bring the intangible, and then utilize constructively other people and their strengths, and so forth, to bring it to life. So it's kind of like a story. I think of introvert intuition is like a story, and you have that story in your mind, and essentially you're trying to communicate it, but it can be very difficult because it's very, very much, it's a lot of imagery, there's a lot of symbolism, there's a lot of metaphors, and so forth. So you tend to have all these insights or revelations, or they could pop up at random moments, and solutions to problems and whatnot, or just what you think subjectively follows. And it can be very hard to compile, if you're using it very deeply, and especially when you get consumed by it, it can kind of close off the external world. So that can kind of potentiate weaknesses. Like, that's why extrovert sensing is the polar opposite to that function. So now you also have extrovert intuition. Extrovert intuition is more about, it's a divergence. It's more like fission. You have fusion, and then this is more like fission. I think of extrovert intuition, it usually it pairs with the introvert sensing. And the reason for this is, like, introvert sensing, because it's introverted, it's a compilation. You compile sensory input and experiences, usually in sequential events. The sequential, and the basically how things played out, and you're basically internalizing the sensory information, compacting it, organizing it, and basically think of, like, you have this whole compact, organized network. And then extrovert intuition comes along and it plays with that. So it takes that compact space and it makes so many different radio projections from there. And the playing field for an extrovert intuition is all about possibilities, all about, and they're very open to these, and especially the stronger the function, it's going to have more divergence, and it's going to be harder to converge the more you diverge. So basically, the stronger the function, it can get more chaotic, more out of hand. But to an extrovert intuitive, it's not chaotic to them because they're acclimated to that state. They're always acclimated to the radio projections that they, and all the ideas that they generate. But at the same time, it's very hard for them to follow through, just like an introvert intuition, because they converge, whereas the extrovert intuitor, is going off in many directions. And if it's going too fast and the frequency is too fast, it's kind of hard for them to grasp onto that. And that's why they need something like maybe introvert thinking to grasp onto it, make sense of it, compact it, and then you can go maybe utilize it. But if the ideas are flooding and there's no compression, there's not much, then it could easily be lost in outer space. So that's the big difference. The extrovert, insists a direction, of course, but then you get into feeling. And now an extrovert feeler, they get reward by doing things for others. They like helping others. Their energy is directed towards harmony. And the reason for this is because they are sensitive to the emotional atmosphere. And for that reason, they utilize it. They want the positive vibes. They want the positive harmony. So therefore, they utilize it's almost as if they're focusing their energy externally, so that way they can manipulate it to satisfy their own desires. They need that harmony, they want it, so they figure out ways to maintain the harmony, and because they're putting their emphasis and focus and energy in that direction. So extrovert feelers are going to generally be they're going to be very expressive a lot of times, um, because they're so attuned to it. The external expression, it's very sensitive, to it. And they're all about changing. They like giving, and just doing things out of courtesy, or doing things that they don't. Usually you can dictate whether someone's extrovert feeler. If they do things out of their way, they go out beyond their way just to make everyone happy. They're always focusing externally outside themselves, and kind of making sacrifices, but it's on a consistent basis. So of course, it's an extroverted function. Now, when you have introverted feelers, they tend to be the ones who, like, I understand myself, or they say stuff like, I'm finally come to grips of who I am, or I want to find, discover myself, so forth, because they want depth of feeling, they want to understand it, they want to you know categorize it, they want to have that reward where they can understand who they are, they want that feedback to grow and develop, and they want to at least and they're kind of against like injustice. They want society as a whole, to have a good judicial, system. They're thinking about the feelings, right? They want everyone to maintain in this good state, positive state, but on a global scale. Because think of extrovert feelers, because they're sensitive to the environment, it kind of their energy is localized to many different areas, So, but introvert field, because they process it internally, they can scale it a little bit larger, generally. So that's why, like, yeah, introvert intuition, it can generally be, they're taking a massive scale and they're trying to pull it all in, so forth. But it all starts from directing it inward, and then condensing it, and then eventually getting a firm, deep, in-depth understanding. So usually at introvert functions, they're going to have the broader depth of understanding, but that's not like. Of course, there's benefits to all of these functions, and I like to think of it like, we wouldn't be in this position of society if it weren't for the divergence, the variation that we have, and we need that variation. It's something that, like, with all the permutations, the combinations that you can put together, if you have someone with a good strength, like, I've noticed a pattern that, like, those who use, for instance, like extrovert feeling, or very expressive, could be very outwardly emotional. They tend to like those who are calm, because that calmness relaxes them. Because think about, if someone is extremely sensitive to the external feeling or the vibes, you want someone who kind of dulls that emotion, so it kind of makes you yourself calm. If you're an emotional person, so of course it kind of like makes sense that they would gravitate in that direction. So of course, like, um, there's many situations like this, and if you take those strengths, eventually, like the strength, someone's weakness kind of converges, and it kind of becomes more, not necessarily strength, but it gets stronger and stronger. Whereas, like, in other direction, like, if someone has a you're spending time with someone who has a, you have a strength, and they have their weakness, uh, that is like based on your strength, or accordance to your strength, then you know it basically kind of converges or comes closer together. And either way, it could be like your weakness, it kind of gets closer and closer to their strength, depending on if you take it in, you're open to the change, because ultimately you have to, everyone has to make some change, in order to progress. And of course, like, that's why, like, I think it's always good to try to find balance as well. And like, if you have an inferior function, usually you learn over time to kind of ways to cope, ways to mitigate it. You kind of try to work on developing it over time, and it could be, because it tends to be more of that inferior, so it's kind of like an insecurity that's kind of in the background, and if you push it off too much, it kind of facilitates more insecurity, or it can kind of make it facilitate more anxiety. So then you kind of learn to you know balance that and bring it to more I guess grounded. But um, that's why I think like there's certain like introverted intuitors who kind of learn to meditate, or they try to kind of learn to find ways to you know get away from because essentially the external world could become chaotic to them because they're kind of putting their narrowed focus on a vision. So, and last but not least, we have extroverted sensing and introverted sensing. Now, these functions, of course, as I explained earlier, you got to consider the direction. So, if you take extroverted sensors, for instance, they're interested in the pleasures of experience, soaking in the external sensory information to gain the rewards. So, whether it's eating, whether it's traveling, the places, soaking in, the they're very driven by beauty, appearance of things, and they're focused on the I guess the material world would have more of a impact on their reward feedback. So and it doesn't, and then in MBTI it doesn't mean they're superficial. These extrovert functions could be seen like that, but everyone has introversion and extroversion stacks, and we all utilize it differently, constructively. It can be constructive, or it can be used destructively. It goes or neutral in different directions. So extrovert sensors, of course, are they gather outside. They're focusing on the specifics more so, and they tend to pick up on the sensory signals, and they're paying attention. They're very aware, and we need this because essentially, when you have introverted intuitors who are kind of like oblivious a lot of times, we need someone who's grounded and someone who's living in the moment, or just having more of their energy put in the moment. Of course, it's just a direction of energy and the reward feedback. And then you have the introverted centers who are very tied to the tradition, the tried and true methods. Or the reason for this is because they tend to have they simulate events. You have the past, and then you have the present moment, but they really soak in the experience and the sequential events that transpire, and they're really building an impression of all these experiences, and kind of it gives them that again a reward, because a lot of times for intuitors are like, remember this experience we had, or remember this, and remember what happened here, and they'll kind of give like this sequential sequence of all the events that transpired, and even the details, and so forth. And it kind of they like going back to like even childhood traditions and stuff like that, because it got soaked in, it got internalized. These sensory information got soaked in, and they actually internalized the feeling, almost like it would be almost like how it affected them, how it impacted them in such a way. So it kind of gets reinforced into the memory, and the memory, when people mention memory, a lot of times it has to do with the internalization, the introverted functions, because that's where you're condensing and compiling information, and however whichever information you're taking and compiling will be different. And so of course it's just with anything, gauging these functions, it could take some time, of course, and especially it gets way more complex when you're putting them together, and how they go work in pairs. And I think like I sometimes, like for instance, extroverted thinking paired with introverted feeling can kind of sometimes act in such a way that it acts almost like an extrovert feeling function, because when they're kind of like paired, it, it can seem as if it acts like that to an extent, but in actuality kind of have like a masking effect. So of course there's like all these variations that could occur, and you can't just like box someone into like there's 16 personality types. I think I mentioned before there's 8 functions apparently, not 16 functions, but 16 types, and depending on the axis what they're judging or perceiving, it splits into half. and then we distribute these like introvert thinking, extrovert thinking, and feeling and so forth, and intuitors, and however we, the processing of information, and then the orientation, and the strengths of, uh, which function is on the top or the dominant, or which is an inferior weakness. Um, so so yeah, like it's important to understand the functions, and I guess it can kind of be utilized in some form just as a understanding, or just uh, to me, like information. As long as you're open to it, it can be useful in some form or fashion. It doesn't have to be necessarily verified by the scientific method, or it doesn't like because with everything there's no we gather so much information. Even science is not perfect, objective. We're categorizing stuff. We categorize as X, Y, Z as true. It could later on be falsified. We're expanding the field, and of course there always has to be. You have to be in order to expand the field. You need to creativity. You need to go beyond the borders, beyond the boundaries of what we know, the known information. Look beyond it. And we have so much variation. Everyone can use intuition. Everyone can use sensing in different circumstances and different events. And it's it just depends on where you orientate your energy, where you receive this feedback, what reward, and that could change over time, of course. But usually, you have your core personality by the time you're in your 20s, or what it's kind of facilitated. It's kind of it's it's strengthened at that point, and there's not. Of course, there's going to be some transients, but you have core traits that a lot of times stick with you. So same with the functions. There's gravitation towards these certain areas, and I think it is interesting. Like with anything, I'm interested in many fields, because ultimately it's when you expand your interest, you can utilize all these different fields to try to build a bridge to different areas, and different revelations and different insights, and have different ideas, and you can play with more ideas. And that, to me, that's interesting. That's how I get reward. I'm always trying to create something new. I was a math major, and I love creating new theorems, new equations. I enjoyed the process. I I just, I always shared my ideas with others. They a lot of times didn't even care. Sometimes people use my ideas, but either way, it gave me that reward. It gave me that feedback every time I bring my ideas, at least out. And ultimately, I've learned that creativity is not really, it's not novel. It's not like original from you creating it. Really, it comes from a point. To me, a point is way back. If you take the trajectory of all events, it's connected on a line. It's connected between all the links, and it gets directed towards a point, and that's the source. So, and the source is well beyond what you don't even know where the source is ultimately. Um, but that's just my input on creativity, and everyone else can have a different idea. And it's just every idea that you generate, it's facilitated by previous information, or bits of information, and whatever our predecessors have accumulated, to get to this point. So yeah, that's all I have for now, and hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.